Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me Why, a short, sharp, we hope, podcast that is designed for busy Beatles people in the know or busy Beatles people who want to be in the know. My name is Jude Southerland Kessler. I'm the author of the John Lennon series. So far, 5 books that you can work out with them if you want to instead of read them. 5 books, the 6th book in the series, which is part 2 of this book. This is the first half of 1965, and the second book, which will be equally large, is the second half of 1965 and just a sliver of 1966. But they tell John's story almost like you're reading a novel. However, everything in the book is highly researched, footnoted, and documented. There are thousands of footnotes in the book. So you're getting what John and the Beatles actually said, did, sang, even ate, and wore. So join me. Check it out at johnlennonseries.com. And today is a special day for me because not only is one of my dear friends on this show, but he is someone that if you haven't met yet, you definitely need to know about, because he was not only John's attorney, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but he was John's friend. And John Lennon didn't trust a whole lot of people, especially people that he called suits, people who wore suits, went to an office, very professional. That wasn't John's person of choice. And yet this person became his person of choice, one of his friends, one of his trusted friends. They worked together shoulder to shoulder in 1975 and 1976 for many months, preparing for and going through a trial against the salacious mobster Morris Levy. Now, this is a gentleman who took John's unfinished. Imagine that you're doing something and someone takes your unfinished product, your unpolished product, and then publishes it as an unsanctioned LP called Roots. Well, needing the best legal representation, New Yorker John Lennon sought an attorney who would be able to represent him in a case against Morris Levy. And he met our guest today. Now, let me tell you, this was the perfect choice because our guest today not only represented Albert Grossman in a trial with his client, Bob Dylan, but he also represented the New York Yankees, the Cleveland Indians, the Cincinnati Reds, and the San Francisco, I think it was Giants. Let me have look. Yes, Giants in salary arbitration in the 80s and 90s. So he totally was the right choice. But what John didn't know, and what we're going to find out about today, is that his new attorney was a Beatles fan. So let me welcome to the show the author of this award-winning book, Lennon, the Mobster and the Lawyer, The Untold Story. Welcome to the show, Jay Bergen. So glad to have you here.
Thank you, Jude. It's always great to be with you, and it's just a thrill to have a chance to talk to you again about my book and your books, and chat about John.
Yeah, I'm trying to save this because I made a list of the 5 things that I love about your book, and I want to save them for when we get to that part. But I have to tell you, Jay, I am so sincere. Your book is such a gold mine, and it's something that we never, ever, ever get. And that's new material. I mean, everybody claims to have never before seen, never before heard. And you know what? They're all seen and they're all heard. But yours is really brand new. And so let's jump into it. We're going to talk about, at first, 2 questions from yesterday and today. No, not this album, but the real yesterday and the real today. So for yesterday, I don't think John had a clue that you actually had been to see the Beatles before, when you were a teenager. So did you go just out of curiosity, or were you an actual fan? Tell me why.
No, I was a fan because I had seen, um, uh, A Hard Day's Night with my former wife in Brooklyn when we lived there, and we were walking home from the theater one night, and I said to her, that was really a terrific movie. I mean, I had heard their first album and everything, and I had it, I bought it, I still have it. And I said, that was really a terrific movie. These guys are for real. So that was A Hard Day's Night. And then when it was announced that they were going to be playing at the Forest Hill Stadium, which, by the way, in those days was where the US Open, which was amateur then, amateur tennis players, was played. And that was in Queens. And, the funny thing was that in order to get a ticket, I drove to a candy store, it's a stationery store on Queens Boulevard in Forest Hills, and just walked in and got, two tickets for one of their shows in August. I think it was August 27th of 1964. And we went to the show, and they landed in a helicopter on one of the back tennis courts. And the floor of the stadium had seated about 16,000 people, but the floor of the stadium was filled with police, those police horses, those barricades to make sure that nobody got on stage. Well, some young woman managed to get on stage, put her arms around George. He kept playing, laughing at the same time. And finally, the police and the security guards, pried her loose. But that was my time seeing the Beatles. I did not see them at Shea Stadium.
There are only two nights that I would choose if I could go back into time and time travel. One, I would like to go back to April of 1962. There was a concert called The Beatles for Their Fans. I get emotional even trying to tell you about this. It was the last night in the Cavern Club that the Beatles wore their leathers. They wore it up to the intermission. And
Wow.
intermission, they went back and changed into their Beano Dorn, into their new, suave suits, and came out on stage. And the girls cried because they knew they'd lost them. They lost, they were gone. They were going to belong to the world. The other
Right.
one is Forest Hills, because when that helicopter started to slowly wind its way down and all those flashes were going off, and Brian was crying because, he knew this was it. I mean, they were gods descending from the heavens. I mean, you couldn't have picked a better night. It was, I mean, it was great. It was just so great. So fast forward to kind of today, we're going to go to, and I'm assuming about 5 or 6 years ago, you go out to wherever you're keeping these six bankers boxes that are loaded with material about John's trial. And you make this decision that you're going to write the story, and you are going to tell the story that was in Lennon, the Mobster and the Lawyer. Now, you've waited a long time to do this. Why did you decide to do it? Tell me why.
Well, I think I had felt this connection to John even after the case was over, and he passed away. But I had these 5 or 6 bankers boxes with the literally almost the entire file of the case, and they followed me around whenever I moved, and I made about 5 house moves. They were always with me. And when my wife Diane and I moved to Saluda in North Carolina, I still had them in a storage room in the garage. And I don't know what made me do this, Jude, but I went out there one day, and I was thinking to myself, what am I going to do with these things? I've had them now for over 40 years. This was 2017, the spring. I sat down on one of the boxes. I pulled out John's testimony, and I started reading some of it. He testified about 363 pages over a number of days. And I started reading it and I thought, oh, there's a story here. And it hasn't been told because at the time that I was John's lawyer and we were working together very closely, it was 1975 to 77, but 75 and 76, when we worked very closely together, that's when he dropped out of the music business. And Sean was born 3 months before the trial. And he made it very clear, without going into any detail with me, that he really wanted to raise whatever this child was going to be, because he had not had that opportunity to do that with Julian because of the Beatlemania. So, I started really reading the material in more detail, and that's what got me going on the book, because it was a story that hadn't been told. There were one or two articles in Rolling Stone, and other than that, we went in and out of the courthouse in 1976 for 20 days, spread over a couple of months. And, we didn't have any crowds. This was the beginning of the time when you had to go through metal detectors. But John testified, and there weren't crowds of people, mobbing us. So it was under the radar.
Yeah, I first heard about your book one night. I was out watering plants. We have a huge patio and hundreds of potted plants. And so I was out there watering, and I got a message, a messenger from a guy named Scott McKinley, whom I didn't know. And he said, I've just done an audio book for Jay Bergen. It's a new book called Lennon, the Mobster and the Lawyer. I would appreciate it if you listen to it and give me some feedback. I usually don't listen to things that people send me. It's not that I don't want to. It's just, I've got 5 more books to write and time is of the essence. I won't be here forever. So I always work, but something made me open that. And when I started listening, I fell in love with the book. It was such an exciting book, and I'm trying to save my good things to say in just a minute. But Scott McKinley was John Lennon. It wasn't some imitator of John Lennon. It wasn't some rinky dink, pretend to be John Lennon. That was John Lennon. And then I started getting entranced by this story, and I bought the book and I read the book, and then I read it again. And my book is underlined and there are notes in it. It's a great book. So I made a list of 5 things I love about your book. But first, you tell me 5 things that you love about your book. Because if we don't love our books, nobody else will.
Well, the first thing is that, it was an untold story. And I was able to tell it because I had the entire transcript of the trial testimony, about 5,000 pages. I had a number of the exhibits we used on the counterclaims. So I was able to just tell the story really in a chronological order, from the time I met John on February 3rd, 1975, which I didn't know he was going to appear at this meeting at Capitol Records. Number 2, it was John just being John Lennon, not the rock and roll icon. I took him to lunch one day in Grand Central Station during his deposition by Levy's lawyers. He'd never been in Grand Central before, and because he was an artist, trained artist, he was knocked out by the spectacular building. I also took him the next day to the Bull and the Bear, which was a restaurant in the Waldorf. He had never been in the Waldorf. So I took him in the main entrance, and we walked through the Art Deco lobby. But he was just trying to be John Lennon, not the rock and roll icon. If people stopped him for an autograph, he'd give them an autograph. The third one was that John was really standing up for not only his rights, but also the rights of a number of early rock and roll artists, many of them Black, who Morris Levy had ripped off. If you look up the Lee Dorsey song "Ya", you will see that one of the authors of that song is Morris Levy or M. Levy. He no more had anything to do with writing that song than I did.
Wow.
But Morris used to do that. He would just tack his name on because he had a number of publishing companies. So he would music publishing. So he would sign these black artists and then he'd just stick his name in there. So he would get, a rake off from the royalties. The fourth reason was John's testimony when we wound up with Judge Grisey, who was a harpsichordist and a pianist in a classical music amateur group. He knew nothing about the Beatles, Jude. Absolutely nothing. He knew vaguely who John Lennon was, and this is really strange because he was a young judge. He'd been on the bench about 4 or 5 years, but he was probably in his mid to late 40s. And he didn't have a clue who the Beatles were. So John and I decided that since he was a musician, we would give him, a tutorial on how the Beatles made music and what rock and roll music was. In fact, when he got the case, the night he got the case, his two law clerks took him back to one of their apartments and played some of the Beatles music so that he would know what it was about.
It's just crazy.
Yes. And then the final thing was that, John and I, we got along. I treated him just like any other client. I never asked him for an autograph. I never asked him for, any photos or anything, although I have two wonderful photos of him that he had Bob Gruen take one of us in a restaurant where we had lunch every day for 20 days, spread over a couple of months, Sloppy Louie's. That's in the book. And, we weren't pals. We didn't hang out, but we got along, and I just treated him like every other client, even though the moment I met him, I was really kind of stunned.
Yeah. You signed my book to Jude. This is a story about John Lennon, the person, not the icon. And that's probably what I love most about it is that you approached it. You're telling about the time that you spent with a client that you really liked and a client that really liked you and a client who is a person, not an icon, you know?
Jude, one day we were driving down to court in the limo. John and Yoko would come every morning and pick us up, and my colleague Howard Roy and I were in the limo going downtown. And John said, do you guys know somebody named Freddie Mercury, a singer?" And we we looked at each other. We're sitting in the jump seats in the limo, and Howard said, "Yeah, well, we know Freddie Mercury."
Yeah.
He said, "Well, whenever I talk to Julian on the telephone from London, that's all he wants to talk about is this somebody named Freddie Mercury." And we said to him, "John, this is a big deal now. Freddie Mercury and his group, I mean, they're big." He said, "Well, I guess I better do some studying on that." But that's how far he had dropped out.
Yeah. And so our quote from now on, when I see you, I say to you from now on, John is the new Grisey. Because Grisey didn't know who he was. John doesn't know who Freddie Mercury is. Oh man. So did you get to finish all your five that you wanted to tell me about? Because I'm going to tell you my five.
Yes, I did. I did. Those are my five.
Okay. everybody who is looking for new material on John Lennon, this is number one, because this is stuff you've never read before. This is stuff you do not know. And this is important material that you've never read. So if you have not yet read Lennon, the Mobster, and the Lawyer, shame on you, and get with it, because this is not stuff that you know. This isn't repeated over and over and over, brand new material, new photos as well. The next thing is there are two things that John talks about in this trial that if you are a Lennon person, you need to read this and understand this because it's important. And the first thing is his concept of how you order songs on an LP. The Beatles didn't do this haphazard. This is why they were so aggravated at Capitol for taking their LPs and switching the songs around. They ordered them specifically to either tell a story or to be an artistic composition creation. Stu Sutcliffe told John, make your LPs into art. And that's what he did. And that's what the Beatles did. Now, he explains that process in this book. I never understood why he did what he did, but after reading this, I did. The other thing is he talks about his favorite songs because obviously the rock and roll LP is going to be the songs that John grew up with. And he explains each one and what they mean to him. And you've never heard that before. I mean, there's a tiny bit of him explaining his cover songs, tiny, in David Sheff's Playboy interviews. But here he goes into detail in Bring It On Home to Me. What are the others, Jay, that he talks about?
Oh, Bebopalula, Boney Maroney. That was the only time his mother saw him perform. He played Boney Maroney. Peggy Sue, by the way, became Judge Griset's favorite song because when the case was over, he was about to have his 5th anniversary, and his law clerk wrote to me, Susan Jackson, and said, "Can you send me each one of the albums? We'd like to give him, the roots and the rock and roll." And I said, "Yeah, sure." So I got them, and she wrote back to me and said, "Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. Now Judge Griset will be able to play his favorite song, Peggy Sue, on and on forever."
That is so great. It's, to hear John open up about how he felt about these songs and what they meant to him and how they reminded of his mom and his sisters and all of these years growing up. This is special. It's really special. The last thing that I had, and it overlaps with what Jay said, is that this friendship, this companionship, and this seeing New York through Jay's eyes. I'm with them as they are standing in Grand Central Station, and John is seeing the beauty and the majesty that is this work of art for the first time. So you're going to want to experience John really seeing a new part of New York City through Jay's friendship and tutelage. It's a great book. So, Jay, in September, you received an honor that caused you to travel up to a place called Cleveland, Ohio. Why were you there? Tell me why.
Well, my wife Diane and I decided at some point earlier this year that we really wanted to find a final home for the files, because first of all, I didn't want to sell them piece by piece, the testimony and the exhibits we used. We had John Lennon and Beatles albums that we used on the counterclaims. And so I finally reached out through a very close friend of mine, David Sussman, who put me in touch with John Sykes, who was the chairman of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Foundation. And he put me in touch with Greg Harris, who's the CEO and president. And on October 8th, we delivered to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 5 bankers boxes with the file, very well organized, and it is now part of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame collection. And we're Diane and I are just thrilled that we found a permanent home for it where people can go and look at it and research some of the material. All the testimony was there, all the exhibits, including a handwritten um, list of the songs on the rock and roll album.
That's amazing. I am so glad. Congratulations. I am really you your decision. If I could have been there as a little fly on the wall when you walked in to that garage and looked at those banker's boxes and you thought I might write this story somewhere, I was going, yes, yes. Because it is truly one of my very favorite John Lennon books. And I thank you for all the work that you put into it. And it's brought, I hope for you, it's brought a lot of new friends because we are so glad to have you in the Beatles world and have you part of the fest and everything. We are just thank you for all you've done.
Well, Jude, I want to thank you and Rand because John testified on cross-examination when Levy's lawyer was trying to get him to say that he and Levy were really close friends. And John said, no, no, I really thought he was a character. John testified, it takes a long time to make close friends. And I really don't have a lot of them, but we may not have, you and I and Jude and Diane may not have known each other for that long, more than a few years now, but we are close friends, and that's important, and that makes this whole experience, a thrill for us, and I really enjoyed your support.
Well, thank you. And I feel the same way. And I can count my friends on one hand. I mean, we have lots of acquaintances,
Yes.
few friends, and I really this has been a blessing to us. So I usually love my short, sharp podcast because I like the idea that someone's busy and they can still, oh, I got a half hour to devote to this, and they do. But today it makes me sad because we could talk forever, but we always close the show by asking everyone to share their favorite John Lennon quote. Now, it can be, a song lyric, it can be something he said to you personally, it can be some famous quote. What's your favorite John Lennon quote, and tell me why?
Well, it's not exactly a quote, but it's not in the book. But John had one rule about autographs. He would give an autograph to anybody as long as I'm not eating. And one day in the spring of 1975, that he would come into the office and we'd work, and then I would walk him home across Central Park because my firm's office was on 55th and Park. And this day, we apparently took a little side trip into the Central Park Zoo, which is a small zoo, but it's really a pretty zoo. It was a beautiful day in May or April or June, and this young mother pushed a stroller towards us, and she recognized John, and she stopped and she said, may I have an autograph? And John said, absolutely. He was always very polite, very friendly, and we didn't have a piece of paper. She reached into the backpack on the stroller and pulled out a pamper, and John signed the pamper. And that's a true story. She signed the pamper because all we had was a pen and the pamper to sign.
That's classic. That's so funny. I bet that was a one and only for him.
I, I'm sure. Well, I shouldn't say I'm sure, but I'm sure he wasn't asked to sign many pampers.
I'm sure not. Well, stories like that are exactly what you will find in Lennon, the Mobster, and the Lawyer. These are, as I've said a bazillion times, things you don't know. And you need to get this book. I don't know if it's still, Jay, is it back up in audiobook yet?
No, we're having trouble with the publishers having trouble straightening out a mess about an earlier uh, email or something that he had, email address, but you can still get it on on Amazon.
Okay. On Audible? It's still on Audible?
It's not on Audible,
Okay.
unfortunately, but
Oh,
you can get what you're holding.
okay. Well, yes. And this is a great book. And you can follow Jay on Facebook, Instagram, and X. And you can see him in person. And that's the best way at the Fest for Beatles fans. Because, like John, Jay will talk to you and he will sign autographs for you, even on your pamper. So if you don't have anything else, bring the pamper. That would be classic. In fact, I think I may do that myself. But he will see you March 28th through the 30th at the Hyatt Regency in Jersey City. It's gorgeous. You're overlooking New York City, and you need to come and hear Jay's presentation. It is not to be missed. Furthermore, while you're there, we are having the book release party for the second half of Shades of Life. It's a book called Some Forever, probably the most exciting book that we've done because it's the 1965 North American tour, including Shea Stadium, the first Shea Stadium, meeting Elvis, writing and making Rubber Soul, getting the MBE investiture, going on the UK tour, which was unbelievable. If you don't know about the 1965 UK tour, the Beatles could have died on about 5 occasions. They were in horrible snowstorms. They were in horrible windstorms. They were driving when no one had any business being on the road. And on the very first night, George's Country Gentleman fell off of the car and was crushed on the highway. So it's an adventurous book, and we're going to have the book release party up there. Jay, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Jude. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all in March.
We will be there and hope that all of you guys will be there too.
Yep.
Until our next episode, Jay and I say goodbye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
And in my Liverpool way, I always leave you with try and shine on.